Christmas used to mean something in my house. For 32 years, my wife Evelyn made cinnamon rolls every Christmas morning, while my son Brian fought with my daughter Kate over which movie to play first. We weren't rich when the kids were young. I worked construction during the day and repaired engines at night just to keep food on the table. Most winters, my hands cracked from cold weather and overtime work, but every December I still climbed onto the roof myself to hang lights because my family loved how the house looked from the street. Back then, I believed sacrifice created loyalty. I believed if you gave your family everything, they would stand beside you when you grew older. That belief died 3 days before Christmas. It started with silence. Brian suddenly stopped returning my calls. Kate avoided visiting the house unless Evelyn invited her directly. Even my wife began acting strange, taking phone calls outside or lowering her voice whenever I entered the room. At first, I ignored it. Families become secretive around holidays. I assumed they were planning a surprise dinner or some vacation. Then I noticed something that changed everything. One evening, I went into my office looking for insurance papers and discovered several property documents missing from my cabinet. Not random papers, specific ones. Tax records, insurance forms, mortgage statements connected to the lake house. That house wasn't just property to me. I bought it 26 years earlier after nearly destroying my health working double shifts. 5 acres near the water.
Private dock.
2-story cedar home with large windows facing the lake. Every important memory in our family happened there. Brian caught his first fish off that dock. Kate learned to drive on the gravel road nearby. My wife and I spent anniversaries sitting beside the fireplace after the kids went to sleep. I planned to retire there someday. When I realized those documents were gone, something immediately felt wrong. The next morning, I asked Evelyn directly while she stood in the kitchen making coffee. "Where are the lake house papers?" She hesitated too long before answering. "Probably packed away somewhere."
No, he replied calmly.
"They were in my office last week." She wouldn't look directly at me anymore. "Well, I didn't touch them." The problem with marriage is that after 35 years, you learn every version of your spouse's voice. I knew when Evelyn lied, and that morning she lied badly. I said nothing else, but later that afternoon, I drove 2 hours to the lake house without telling anyone. Snow covered most of the driveway, but fresh tire tracks cut through the ice. Someone had been there recently. The moment I stepped inside, my stomach tightened. The walls looked emptier. Family pictures above the fireplace were gone. Decorative shelves had been cleared. Several pieces of furniture were missing too. It looked staged, like someone preparing the place for strangers to walk through. Then I entered the kitchen and found a stack of real estate brochures sitting openly on the counter beside a bottle of cleaning spray. A realtor's business card rested on top. Melissa Harper, Senior Property Consultant. Underneath the card sat a handwritten note that made my blood run cold. Final staging before New Year. Sellers should remove remaining personal items. Sellers, plural. I stared at that word for nearly 10 seconds. Nobody had discussed selling the lake house with me. Nobody had even hinted at it. I immediately called Brian. He answered after several rings, sounding nervous already. "Hey, Dad. Why is there a realtor inside my house?" Silence filled the line instantly. Then came a slow sigh. "Dad, we were going to tell you after Christmas." "We." Another silence. The family agreed it's time to move on from the property. I actually laughed hearing that sentence. Not because it was funny, but because of how quickly they erased me from the decision. "Interesting," I said quietly. "And when exactly was I removed from this family meeting?" "Dad, don't make this difficult," Brian replied. "The money would help everyone." There it was. Money. Always the real reason underneath fake emotional speeches. "How much have you already divided?" I asked him. He didn't answer. That told me enough. "Kate's business is struggling," he finally admitted. "Me and Rachel need a larger home. Mom said downsizing would be easier for you too. Easier for me. My own retirement home being sold behind my back somehow became a favor to me. I walked slowly through the empty living room while my son continued explaining why stealing from me was supposedly practical. Then he made the mistake that changed everything. Honestly, Dad, you barely even use the place anymore. I stopped walking immediately. At that moment, the hurt disappeared completely. Hurt can be emotional. What replaced it was colder than emotion. Clear thinking. Who signed the paperwork? I asked calmly. Mom handled most of it. I hung up immediately after that. Then I walked upstairs into the small office overlooking the lake and opened the desk drawer where I kept backup legal copies years ago. Inside sat the original deed documents exactly where I left them decades earlier. I unfolded the papers slowly and looked at the ownership line. One name.
Mine.
26 years earlier, my attorney advised me to place the lake house solely under my ownership after Evelyn's brother got buried in lawsuits and debt collectors started targeting extended family assets. At the time, Evelyn agreed it was smarter for legal protection. Later, we simply never changed it, which meant my wife and children spent weeks planning the sale of property they did not legally own. I sat beside the window looking out at the frozen lake while snow fell quietly outside. Then, for the first time since entering that house, I smiled. Because my family believed they had already won. They had no idea Christmas dinner was about to become the biggest mistake of their lives. Christmas Eve arrived cold and heavy with snow, but inside my house everyone acted unusually cheerful. Too cheerful. Brian arrived first carrying expensive wine he normally could not afford. His wife Rachel followed behind him talking non-stop about new beginnings and fresh opportunities. Then Kate showed up wearing a designer coat even though her business had supposedly been struggling for months. Nobody realized how obvious they looked to me now. Once you know people are hiding something, every fake smile becomes visible. Evelyn moved around the kitchen nervously all evening, avoiding direct eye contact every time our conversation drifted toward the lake house. I stayed calm. Calm people frighten guilty people more than angry ones. Dinner started normally enough. Turkey, mashed potatoes, Christmas music playing softly in the background. But underneath the fake holiday atmosphere, tension sat at the table like another guest nobody acknowledged. Brian kept glancing toward Evelyn. Kate barely touched her food. Rachel smiled too often. Finally, halfway through dinner, Brian lifted his wine glass and cleared his throat. "I want to make a toast," he announced. Everyone looked at him immediately except me. I already knew where this was going. "To family," he said proudly, "and to exciting changes coming next year." Kate smiled instantly, especially everything finally moving forward with the lake house situation. Rachel added, "Honestly, this could help everyone start fresh financially." Nobody stopped her. Nobody corrected her. They had already spent the money in their heads. I slowly placed my fork down onto the plate and looked around the table carefully. "Interesting," I said calmly. "Sounds like important decisions were made." Brian shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, we didn't want to upset you during the holidays. So instead you planned to tell me after selling my retirement home?" Evelyn finally spoke. "Frank, please don't make this dramatic." Dramatic. Another interesting word. I spent decades paying every mortgage bill, every tax payment, every repair invoice connected to that property. Yet somehow objecting to betrayal made me dramatic. Kate leaned forward trying to sound reasonable. "Dad, you and Mom don't need that giant place anymore." Rachel nodded immediately. "And the market is perfect right now. It just makes financial sense." I stared at her for several seconds before answering. Financial sense for who? Silence spread across the table instantly. Brian finally sighed heavily like I was the problem in the room. "Dad, look, Kate needs help with her business. Me and Rachel want to move before the baby comes. Mom deserves less stress. We're thinking about the future here." I almost laughed hearing that sentence because apparently everybody's future mattered except mine. "So you already divided the money," I said quietly. Brian avoided eye contact. That confirmed everything. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "Tell me something. At any point during this plan, did anyone think to ask the actual owner of the property?" Brian frowned immediately. What does that mean? I stood up from the table without answering and walked calmly toward my office. Behind me, I heard nervous whispers begin instantly. 30 seconds later, I returned holding a dark blue folder in my hands. The original deed documents. I placed the folder directly in front of Evelyn. Go ahead, I told her calmly. Read the ownership section out loud. Her face changed immediately. She knew exactly what was inside that folder. Kate looked confused. Mom! Evelyn didn't move. So Brian grabbed the paperwork himself and scanned the first page quickly. Then his entire expression collapsed. Wait! He whispered. Rachel leaned toward him. What? Brian looked up at me slowly. Dad's the only owner. Nobody spoke for nearly 5 full seconds. Kate suddenly grabbed the papers from him and reread them herself. No, she muttered. Mom said both names were on it. Evelyn looked trapped now, like someone standing in front of an oncoming truck. I folded my hands calmly. Your mother assumed we changed the ownership years ago. We never did. Brian stared at Evelyn in disbelief. You told us the house belonged to both of you. I thought it did, Evelyn replied weakly. You thought. I interrupted sharply. That's the impressive part of this entire situation. Nobody verified anything. Nobody consulted a lawyer. None of you even asked me directly because you were too busy calculating your share of the profits. Rachel crossed her arms defensively. Nobody was trying to steal from you. I looked directly at her. You discussed dividing proceeds from property you did not legally own. Explain the difference. She said nothing after that, because she couldn't. Brian suddenly became angry instead of embarrassed. So what now? He snapped. You're just going to hold this over everyone's head?
No, Ian suarat calmly.
I'm going to protect what belongs to me. Kate's voice turned desperate. Dad, please don't do something irrational. I almost smiled hearing my own daughter describe defending my property as irrational. Then I opened the folder again and removed another set of papers prepared earlier that week by my attorney. As of January, I announced quietly, the lake house transfers into an irrevocable trust. Brian frowned immediately. What does that even mean? It means none of you will ever own it. The room froze again. Evelyn looked horrified. Frank? No, I interrupted coldly. You already made your decision when you tried selling my future behind my back. Kate stood up now. Who gets the property then? I looked directly at every person sitting at that table before answering. A Veterans Housing Foundation in my father's name. Brian slammed his hand against the table. You're giving away almost $1 million because you're angry? No, I corrected him calmly. I'm giving it away because I finally understand something important. He stared at me silently. I looked around the room one last time before speaking again. I spent 30 years believing I was building security for my family. Turns out I was just building something they planned to cash out the moment I became inconvenient. Nobody spoke after that. The only sound in the room came from the old clock hanging beside the kitchen doorway. Tick, tick, tick. 30 years earlier, Evelyn bought that clock at an antique market during one of our first vacations together. Back then, she said she loved it because it sounded steady and dependable. Funny how objects survive longer than loyalty does. Brian was the first person to move. He stood up so quickly his chair nearly tipped backward. You can't be serious, he said sharply. You're throwing away your relationship with your entire family over one misunderstanding. I looked directly at him. A misunderstanding is forgetting to buy milk. Secretly selling someone's property is called betrayal. Kate crossed her arms immediately. Dad, that's unfair. Unfair, I repeated calmly. You planned where the money would go before speaking a single word to me. Rachel suddenly jumped in again. Nobody forced you out of anything. I turned toward her slowly. Really? Then explain why I found staging notes in my own house before hearing one sentence from my family. She opened her mouth, then stopped. Evelyn finally stood up too, looking exhausted now instead of defensive. Frank, we made mistakes. Fine. But humiliating everyone on Christmas Eve solves nothing. I almost laughed hearing that. Interesting choice of words. You're worried about humiliation after trying to erase me from decisions involving my own property. Brian slammed his glass onto the table hard enough to spill wine across the tablecloth. You always do this, he snapped. Everything has to be about control with you. That sentence hit differently because for a second, I actually saw the little boy he used to be. Brian always hated hearing the word no growing up. Evelyn softened every punishment while I enforced rules. She called me strict. I called it parenting. Apparently, my son spent years confusing discipline with oppression. Control, I replied quietly. You attempted to sell a house I legally own. Because you never share anything, Brian shouted. You sit on money while everyone else struggles. Kate nodded immediately beside him. You could help this family easily, Dad. There it was. The truth finally surfaced underneath the fake emotional speeches. This was never about simplifying life for me. It was never about downsizing or stress reduction. It was about access to money. I leaned back slowly in my chair and studied both my children carefully. Do you know how many times I saved this family financially? Neither answered. So I continued. When Brian failed out of college the first time, who paid the tuition for him to go back? Brian looked away instantly. When Kate's business collapsed 2 years ago, who covered her debt so she wouldn't lose her apartment? Kate stayed silent too. When Rachel's surgery wasn't fully covered by insurance, who wrote the check without asking for repayment? Rachel lowered her eyes immediately. I nodded once. Every crisis in this family somehow became my responsibility. But the moment you saw an opportunity to profit from something valuable, suddenly I became unnecessary. Evelyn sat back down, slowly looking pale now. Frank, please stop. But I wasn't finished. 35 years of resentment had finally reached the surface. You know the most interesting part? I continued calmly. None of you even invited me to the conversations. That means somewhere along the line, you stopped seeing me as a person entirely. I became an account balance. Brian shook his head angrily. That's not true. Then why was I the last person informed about selling my own property? He couldn't answer. Nobody could. The silence stretched painfully across the room until Kate finally whispered, We thought you'd say no. I looked directly at her. Exactly. That single word crushed the room again because it exposed everything. They knew it was wrong before they ever started. Otherwise, they would have asked openly. Evelyn suddenly began crying quietly at the table. 20 years ago, seeing her cry would have destroyed me emotionally. Now I mostly felt tired. I never wanted this to happen, she whispered. Then you should have stopped it, I answered. Brian grabbed his coat aggressively. Fine. If that's how you want it, enjoy the damn house alone. He started toward the front door immediately. Rachel followed behind him without saying goodbye. Kate remained seated another few seconds before standing slowly herself. Dad, she said quietly, you're destroying this family. I looked at my daughter carefully before answering. No. I'm discovering what this family already became. Then she left too. The front door slammed hard enough to shake the hallway picture frames. Suddenly the house became silent except for Evelyn crying softly across the table from me. We sat there without speaking for almost a full minute. Finally, she looked up. Did you really transfer the house already? The paperwork finalizes next month. You'd really give it away? I folded my hands together calmly. Yes. Her eyes widened slightly. Why? That question surprised me because after everything that happened, she still didn't understand. I looked around the dining room slowly. Christmas decorations covered every wall. Family photographs filled every shelf. Decades of memories surrounded us. Yet somehow none of it meant enough to stop betrayal. Because if my own family sees me as nothing except a financial asset, I answered quietly, then I'd rather the property help strangers who still understand gratitude. Evelyn stared at me silently with tears running down her face. Then she whispered the one sentence I never expected to hear from her. I think I ruined everything. I stood up slowly from the table and put on my coat.
No, he replied calmly.
You just revealed what was already broken. Christmas morning felt colder than any winter I could remember. The house was silent. No loud music from Brian. No smell of Kate burning breakfast while pretending she could cook. No wrapping paper scattered across the living room floor. For the first time in over 3 decades, I sat alone drinking coffee beside the window while snow covered the driveway outside. Evelyn stayed upstairs most of the morning. After the argument the night before, neither of us had much left to say. Around 10 o'clock, my phone finally started ringing. Brian. I ignored it. Then Kate called. After that came 3 text messages from Rachel talking about working things out as a family. Funny how quickly people rediscover family values once money disappears. I turned the phone upside down on the table and continued drinking my coffee in silence. Around noon, there was a knock at the front door. I already knew who it was before opening it. Brian stood outside looking exhausted and angry at the same time. Rachel waited behind him near the car. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside without answering. The moment he entered the house, his eyes scanned the Christmas decorations like he suddenly realized how different everything felt now. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table while I remained standing. "Dad," he started carefully, "things got out of control last night." "No," I corrected him. "Things became honest last night." He rubbed both hands across his face. "We made mistakes. You made plans." He looked down immediately. "Mom thought you'd eventually agree. So your solution was hiding it from me until the sale was already moving forward?" He had no answer for that. Brian sat there silently for several seconds before finally saying the truth out loud.
"I'm drowning financially."
That got my attention because it was the first honest sentence I'd heard from him in weeks. He leaned back heavily in the chair. The new company downsized. Rachel's hours got cut. The baby's coming in 4 months. I panicked. I listened quietly while he spoke. When Mom mentioned the lake house, it felt like the only way out. I nodded slowly. "So you convinced yourself betrayal was practical." He closed his eyes briefly after hearing that. "I know how bad it sounds."
"No," he replied calmly.
"You know how bad it is." Brian looked older sitting there that morning. Stress does that to people. Suddenly I remembered him at 17 asking me for help after crashing my truck into a ditch during a snowstorm. He looked exactly the same then. Terrified, ashamed, waiting for rescue. The difference was simple. Back then he admitted the truth immediately. "Did you know the worst part for me?" I asked quietly. He looked up. "It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the secret meetings. It was realizing my own son believed I deserved no voice in my future." Brian swallowed hard but said nothing. I sat down across from him finally. "You know why I worked myself nearly into the grave all those years?" He shook his head slowly. "Because I grew up watching my father lose everything after trusting the wrong people. I promised myself my family would never struggle like that." Brian stared at the table quietly while I continued. Every overtime shift, every missed vacation, every night repairing engines after construction work. It all went into protecting this family. I paused briefly, and somehow that protection turned into entitlement. Rachel entered the kitchen quietly then, holding her coat tightly around herself. "We're sorry," she said softly. I looked directly at her. "Sorry because you hurt me or sorry because the deal failed?" She couldn't answer immediately. That silence mattered. Then unexpectedly, Evelyn appeared in the doorway upstairs. Her eyes looked swollen from crying most of the night. She walked slowly into the kitchen and sat beside Brian. "I told them it was my fault," she said quietly. I looked at her without speaking. "I started this," she admitted. "I kept talking about how much the property was worth. I made everyone believe selling it would solve their problems." Brian looked surprised hearing her confess openly. Evelyn stared at the table while continuing. "I think somewhere along the line, we stopped seeing the house as your dream and started seeing it as money waiting to be unlocked. Nobody moved after that. Because for the first time, somebody finally said the real truth clearly." I leaned back in my chair and studied my family sitting there in silence. exhausted faces, broken trust, 35 years of history hanging by a thread. Then Brian spoke again quietly. Are you really giving the property away? Yes. Even after this conversation? Especially after this conversation. Rachel looked stunned. Why? I answered immediately. Because consequences matter. Silence returned again. Then something unexpected happened. Brian nodded slowly. Not angrily. Not emotionally. Just quietly accepting it. I guess we earned that, he admitted. That sentence changed something in the room because it was the first moment anyone accepted responsibility without excuses. Evelyn suddenly began crying again. Softer this time. I never thought we'd become this kind of family. I stood up slowly from the table and walked toward the living room window overlooking the snow outside. Neither did I answered quietly. Then I looked back at them one final time. But maybe now you finally understand something important. Money doesn't destroy families. It reveals them.